A strange thing happens when people finally get a free moment now. Not a vacation, not a weekend, just 30 seconds. An elevator ride, a line at a grocery store, a few minutes before someone arrives. Watch what happens. Most people don't simply wait anymore. Their hand moves first. A pocket, a screen, a notification, anything. The silence barely has time to arrive before something replaces it. What's strange is that many of us don't even notice we're doing it. A few years ago, I caught myself unlocking my phone while already using my phone. I wish that were an exaggeration. I had opened an app, forgotten why I opened it, closed it, and immediately opened something else. Not because I wanted anything, not because I was interested in anything, just because there was a gap. And the gap felt difficult to leave alone. That realization stayed with me. Not because it seemed unhealthy, because it seemed automatic. As if somewhere along the way, my mind had stopped treating silence as a place to rest and started treating it as a problem to solve. Maybe you've noticed something similar. You finish watching one video and another begins. You finish reading something and immediately search for the next thing. You reach the end of a podcast and feel an urge to start another before the previous voice has fully disappeared. The content itself almost becomes irrelevant. What matters is that something continues. Anything. Everything keeps moving. And after a while, something unusual starts happening. The world becomes quieter than your mind. Not louder. Quieter. The noise is no longer coming from outside. It's coming from inside. And that's a much harder thing to turn off. Maybe the strangest part is how normal all of this feels. Most people don't wake up and decide to spend their day avoiding silence. If anything, it happens in moments so small they're easy to miss. You're waiting for the coffee machine. You pull out your phone. You're standing in line somewhere. You check something. You're walking to your car. A podcast starts. You're brushing your teeth. The video keeps playing from the bathroom counter. None of these things seem important on their own. And maybe they aren't. The strange part is what almost never happens instead. Nothing. A few years ago, there were countless moments during the day when your attention simply had nowhere to go. You waited. You looked around. You got bored for a minute. Your thoughts wandered somewhere unexpected. Now those small empty spaces disappear almost as quickly as they appear. Not because someone took them away, because we've become remarkably good at filling them. Sometimes I notice myself checking the weather without caring about the weather. Reading headlines I won't remember 10 minutes later. Opening an app and forgetting why I opened it before the screen even loads. I don't think that's unusual anymore. In fact, I think it's become so common that we rarely stop to question it. The behavior itself isn't the interesting part. The speed is. How quickly the mind reaches for something. Almost before the silence has fully arrived. Maybe you've experienced that strange moment when a video ends. For a second, there's nothing. No voice, no music, no movement. And before the stillness can settle, your hand is already searching for the next thing. Not because you're excited, not because you're deeply interested, just because the pause feels incomplete, as though something is missing. I used to think this was about entertainment, or information, or attention spans. Now I'm not so sure, because sometimes the content barely matters. One video replaces another. One song replaces another. One notification replaces another. One conversation replaces another. The specific thing changes. The continuous stimulation remains. And after a while, you begin to notice something uncomfortable. The moments that feel hardest to tolerate aren't necessarily stressful ones. They're empty ones. A red light, an elevator, a quiet lunch, a few minutes before falling asleep. The kinds of moments that used to pass unnoticed. Now, they can feel oddly restless. Not painful, not dramatic. Just slightly unsettled. Like reaching for an object that should be there and realizing your hand closed around empty space. Maybe that sounds familiar. Or maybe not. I'm not sure. But sometimes I wonder if many of us have quietly lost contact with a part of ourselves we used to meet in those small gaps. Not during major life events. Not during deep reflection. Just during ordinary moments. Looking out a window. Sitting on a bus. Waiting for someone to arrive. Doing absolutely nothing for a minute or two. The kind of experiences that seem insignificant until they disappear. And most disappearances don't announce themselves. They happen gradually. So gradually that one day you realize you haven't spent more than a few uninterrupted minutes alone with your own thoughts in weeks. Not because you were avoiding them intentionally, because there was always something else available. Another screen, another voice, another distraction, another way to keep moving. And after enough years of that, something curious begins to happen. The absence of stimulation starts feeling stranger than the stimulation itself, as though silence became the unusual experience, as though doing nothing became something we no longer quite remember how to do. At first, it seems obvious what's happening. The world became louder, more notifications, more information, more content than any human being could ever consume. So naturally, the mind became noisier too. That explanation makes sense. I've believed it myself. But the longer I think about it, the less convinced I am that it's the whole story. Because there are moments when the noise continues even after the stimulation disappears. You close the app. The thoughts remain. You turn off the video. Something inside keeps talking. You leave the crowded room. The feeling follows you home, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if all the noise we surround ourselves with isn't creating the restlessness? What if it's helping us avoid noticing it? I'm not sure, but sometimes I think we've become so focused on what we're consuming that we've stopped asking why we're consuming it in the first place. A person can spend an entire evening moving from one distraction to another and never once ask what happens if they stop. Not forever, just for a minute, a genuine minute. No scrolling, no music, no background voice, no task, no plan. just the experience of being alone with whatever happens to be there. And for many people, that sounds surprisingly difficult, not because they're weak, not because they're addicted, not because something is wrong with them. It simply feels unfamiliar, like using a muscle that hasn't been used in years. Long before smartphones existed, someone noticed something strange about human beings. Given enough opportunities, we often find ways to escape from ourselves, not from danger, not from suffering, from ourselves. That observation has always stayed with me because it feels both obvious and unsettling. Most people say they want peace. I think that's true, but wanting peace and wanting stillness may not be exactly the same thing. Peace sounds comforting. Stillness is different. Stillness leaves you alone with your thoughts. And sometimes your thoughts are not particularly welcoming. Sometimes they arrive carrying unfinished conversations, old disappointments, questions you've been postponing, loneliness you successfully outran during the day. Nothing dramatic, just small emotional leftovers. The kinds of feelings that don't disappear simply because you stayed busy. Maybe that's why silence can feel strangely crowded. Not because nothing is there, because too much is there. Things that rarely get a chance to speak. Things that spend most of their lives waiting beneath the constant. Movement. I remember hearing someone describe boredom as a problem to solve. The more I think about it, the more curious it sounds. Because boredom itself rarely hurts. What often follows it can. The first few moments after stimulation stops are usually uneventful. Then the mind begins reaching, searching, wandering, sometimes toward ideas, sometimes toward worries, sometimes toward parts of yourself you haven't visited in a long time. And maybe that's the moment many of us have quietly learned to interrupt. A notification arrives, a video starts, a message appears. The uncomfortable doorway closes before we have to walk through it. Again, I don't think most people do this consciously. I don't think they wake up each morning planning to avoid themselves. If anything, the opposite is true. Most people genuinely want clarity. They want to feel calmer, more present, less mentally crowded. Yet somewhere along the way, we adopted habits that make those things increasingly difficult to reach. It's a strange contradiction. We say we're exhausted by constant stimulation. Then we seek more stimulation the moment a gap appears. We say we want a quieter mind. Then we fill every silent corner of the day. We say we're overwhelmed, then become uneasy when nothing is demanding our attention. Maybe that contradiction isn't a failure. Maybe it's a clue. Maybe the real question isn't why the world feels so noisy. Maybe the more difficult question is what we're afraid we might hear if it ever became quiet. I don't know. But sometimes that feels closer to the truth than any explanation about technology or attention spans ever could. Maybe that's why true silence can feel surprisingly emotional. Not dramatic, not life-changing, just emotional in quiet ways. The kind you don't notice while you're busy. There are thoughts that seem to wait for certain conditions. Not because they're important, because they're patient. They sit somewhere in the background while the day keeps moving, while emails arrive, while videos play, while conversations happen, while one task replaces another. And then, occasionally, everything slows down enough for them to reappear. A memory surfaces. A question returns. A feeling you thought had already passed quietly taps you on the shoulder. Sometimes it's something small. Wondering why you stopped talking to someone. Realizing you've been saying you're tired for months. Noticing that a goal you've been chasing doesn't excite you the way it used to. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make an interesting story. Just ordinary things. The kinds of thoughts people carry around every day without fully looking at them. Maybe that's part of what makes them so easy to avoid. They're rarely urgent, they're rarely loud, they don't demand attention. They simply wait. I think that's why constant stimulation can be so appealing. Not because every piece of content is enjoyable. Most of it isn't. Most people have experienced the strange feeling of scrolling through things they don't even care about. Reading comments they immediately forget. Watching clips they barely remember an hour later. The experience itself often feels unsatisfying, yet somehow we continue, which suggests we might be looking for something other than entertainment. Maybe we're looking for distance, a little distance from whatever has been quietly waiting underneath. I don't know. Sometimes I think about how quickly people reach for stimulation after a difficult day. And honestly, that makes sense. Who wouldn't want relief? Who wouldn't want a break from uncertainty? The strange part is that we often do the same thing after ordinary days, too. Nothing bad happened. Nothing particularly stressful occurred. Yet the urge remains. One more video, one more article, one more distraction before bed, as if stillness itself has become exhausting. Maybe because stillness has a way of revealing things, not all at once, just little pieces. You stare out a window for a few minutes and suddenly remember a version of yourself you haven't thought about in years. You sit quietly and realize you've been lonely in ways that are difficult to explain. You take a walk without headphones and notice how restless your mind actually feels. Not because something is wrong, because you finally have enough silence to hear it. And sometimes what we hear isn't profound. That's another thing people rarely talk about. The mind isn't always hiding deep wisdom. Sometimes it's just repeating the same concern for the 100th time. Sometimes it's replaying an awkward conversation. Sometimes it's worrying about something that will probably be fine. Human thoughts are often repetitive, messy, unimpressive, but they're ours. And maybe that's part of the discomfort. Spending time with your own mind means spending time with something unfinished, something unresolved, something that doesn't always make sense. Most of us are far more patient with other people's imperfections than we are with our own. We can sit with a friend's confusion, a friend's uncertainty, a friend's sadness. Yet when those same experiences appear inside us, our first instinct is often to reach for something that makes them disappear, or at least become quieter for a while. Maybe that's why so many people feel mentally crowded now. Not because there are too many thoughts, because there are too many thoughts that never get fully heard. They get interrupted, postponed, covered by noise, then return later in slightly different forms, again and again, not demanding attention, just asking for a little space. And perhaps that's what makes the mind feel so busy. Not that it contains too much, but that so much of it remains unfinished. Maybe the quiet never disappeared. Maybe we just stopped noticing it. It still shows up in small places. A few seconds before the coffee starts brewing, the walk from one room to another, the moment after a conversation ends, and before you decide what to do next. Tiny openings, easy to miss. Most of them pass by unnoticed. Not because they're rare, because something else usually arrives first. A screen, a notification, a voice, a habit. And to be fair, habits are powerful things. After enough years, they stop feeling like choices. You don't decide to fill every empty moment. No, you simply do. The same way you lock a door without thinking about it, or take the same route home without remembering the drive. The behavior becomes invisible, which is why so many people assume their minds are busy all the time. Maybe they are. But sometimes I wonder if what we call mental noise is partly something else, not noise, just neglected attention. Thoughts that have been waiting in line for a very long time. Feelings that never found the right moment. Questions that kept getting postponed because there was always something more urgent to focus on. One thing I've noticed is that the mind often settles more slowly than we expect. People talk about silence as if it should feel peaceful immediately. But that hasn't been my experience, and I don't think it's the experience of most people. The first moments are usually restless, a little uncomfortable, like walking into a room after a loud party has ended. The music is gone, yet somehow it still feels present. The mind keeps moving at a speed the environment no longer requires. Maybe you felt that before. You finally have nothing to do, nothing demanding your attention. And instead of feeling relaxed, you feel strangely impatient, as if you're waiting for something, though you're not entirely sure what. A message, a task, a distraction, anything that gives your attention somewhere to go. Then, if you stay there long enough, something begins to change. Not dramatically. Most important things don't happen dramatically. The urgency starts loosening a little. Thoughts become less crowded. Not because they disappear, because they stop arriving all at once. The mind starts behaving less like a crowded train station and more like a conversation. One thought, then another. A memory, a question, a small observation. Nothing demanding, nothing shouting, just things appearing as they are. I sometimes think we've forgotten that there is a difference between being alone and feeling alone. The two can look identical from the outside. A quiet room, a dark window, nobody else around. Yet internally, they are completely different experiences. One feels like absence. The other feels like presence, not the presence of another person, the presence of yourself. And maybe that sounds strange. We're accustomed to talking about relationships with other people, healthy relationships, difficult relationships, broken relationships. Rarely do we talk about the relationship we have with our own company, whether we enjoy it, whether we trust it, whether we know how to remain there without immediately searching for an exit. Outside, a car passes. A neighbor closes a door. Somewhere, another screen lights up in another apartment. The world keeps moving. It always will. But every now and then, there is a brief moment when nothing is asking anything from you. No performance, no response, no decision. Just a few quiet seconds. And perhaps those moments aren't empty after all. Perhaps we've simply spent so long avoiding them that we've forgotten what they contain. I think many people spend years trying to solve a problem that isn't actually a problem. They notice the restlessness, the constant mental movement, the inability to fully relax. And naturally, they assume something needs fixing. A better routine, a different app, a productivity system, a meditation technique, something, anything that might finally quiet the noise. And sometimes those things help. But I wonder if there are moments when the mind isn't asking to be fixed at all, only heard. Not every feeling arrives with a clear explanation. Some arrive as a vague heaviness, a strange dissatisfaction on an otherwise normal day. The sense that something feels slightly off, even when nothing appears wrong. Most people know that feeling. The difficult part is that it rarely fits neatly into language. You can't always explain it to someone else. Sometimes you can't even explain it to yourself. So it stays in the background, following you through ordinary days, showing up in small ways, a shorter attention span, a little more irritation, a little less patience, an urge to stay busy. An urge to keep moving. Not because movement feels good, because stopping feels uncertain. And uncertainty is uncomfortable, not unbearable, just uncomfortable enough. The kind of discomfort that makes distraction feel attractive. I don't think human beings are naturally afraid of silence. That explanation has never felt quite right to me. I think we're afraid of what silence occasionally reveals. Not terrible secrets, not hidden truths, just realities we've postponed. Noticing how tired we've become, how disconnected we've become, how long it's been since we felt genuinely present in our own lives. Sometimes the realization is surprisingly ordinary. You look up from a screen and discover an hour disappeared. You finish a day and struggle to remember where your attention actually went. You sit quietly for a few minutes and become aware of a feeling that's apparently been there all week. Waiting. Not demanding attention. Simply waiting. And maybe that's what makes these moments so important. They're some of the few opportunities we have to meet ourselves outside of performance, outside productivity, outside entertainment, outside the endless pressure to become something. For a brief moment, there's nobody to impress, nothing to achieve, nothing to optimize. Just your own experience exactly as it is. Messy, incomplete, uncertain, human. Long before anyone worried about screen time, There were people who noticed that many of us spend our lives searching for ways to escape this encounter. Not because we hate ourselves, because we don't quite know how to remain with ourselves. It's a subtle difference, an important one. The goal was never to become perfectly calm, or perfectly mindful, or permanently at peace. Human beings were never designed for that. The mind wanders, it worries, it revisits old memories, it creates problems, it imagines futures. That's what minds do. Perhaps the real question is whether we can stay present long enough to listen without immediately reaching for the nearest exit. Whether we can sit with an unfinished thought for a few moments. Whether we can allow uncertainty to exist without rushing to cover it. Whether we can remain in our own company long enough to recognize that the noise was never an enemy. It was a conversation, one that had been trying to happen for a very long time. And maybe, little by little, that changes the feeling. Maybe the mind becomes less like a machine that refuses to stop, and more like a part of you that has been patiently waiting for your attention. Not demanding it, not forcing it, simply waiting. The way many important things do. Maybe this is where many people expect a solution, a method, a habit, something practical to do tomorrow morning. And honestly, I understand that. When something feels uncomfortable, it's natural to want an answer, a way forward, a way out. But the longer I've thought about this, the less convinced I am that every uncomfortable experience is asking to be solved. Some are asking to be noticed. There is a difference, a surprisingly important one, because if the goal is complete silence, most of us will probably be disappointed. The mind was never built for permanent stillness. Even on good days, thoughts wander. They revisit old memories. They imagine conversations that haven't happened. They worry about things that may never occur. Human beings have been doing that for a very long time. Long before phones. Long before algorithms. Long before anyone measured attention spans. The wandering itself isn't new. Maybe what has changed is our tolerance for it. Our willingness to sit beside it for a few moments without immediately trying to replace it with something else. And perhaps that's why those small, quiet moments matter. Not because they're productive, not because they're healing, not because they transform your life overnight. Most of them won't. A few seconds looking through a window probably won't change anything. A short walk without headphones may feel completely ordinary. Sitting alone with your thoughts for a minute before bed might seem insignificant. And maybe it is. But life is often shaped by experiences that feel insignificant while they're happening. Not because they solve anything, because they reconnect us with something we were slowly losing contact with, ourselves. Not the polished version, not the version that performs well, not the version that knows exactly what to say. Just the ordinary one, the unfinished one, the one that still has questions, the one that still feels uncertain sometimes, the one that gets tired, the one that occasionally feels lonely, the one that doesn't always know what it wants, the one that's simply human. Maybe that version has been waiting more patiently than we realize, waiting beneath the notifications, beneath the constant movement, beneath the endless stream of things competing for our attention, not demanding to be heard, not fighting for attention, just waiting, the way quiet things often do. And perhaps the next time you find yourself reaching for a distraction, the moment a small gap appears, nothing needs to change immediately. Maybe you still open the app. Maybe you still play the video. Maybe you don't. It doesn't really matter tonight. The important thing might simply be noticing the moment before it happens. The brief space between the silence and the habit. Because sometimes awareness arrives long before change does. And sometimes that is enough for now. The room becomes quiet. A thought appears. Then another. The world keeps moving outside, as it always will. And maybe, for a few seconds, nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be solved. Nothing needs to become anything else. Maybe it's enough to sit there and listen. Just for a moment. Just long enough to remember that your own mind is not a place you have to escape from.